Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be looking at episodes 1 through 6 of Vinland Saga. If you're already familiar with the story, I'll go ahead and have a timestamp that you can skip ahead to the spoiler section, but for those of you that are looking for just general thoughts, this is something that I am familiar with beyond just these first 6 episodes, as I've been a huge fan of Vinland Saga for years, and I thus kind of have an idea of where the story goes and can give a little bit more of an overview than I would if this was a traditional first impressions. But the non-spoiler setup for the story is that you follow a young boy named Thorfinn, who at the beginning of the story has had something dear to him taken from him, and that sets him on a path of revenge. Definitely, I think that Vinland Saga is playing off of the typical revenge quest type of story, and what I think makes it very unique is that it doesn't shy away from embracing a lot of the tropes that arise in these sorts of stories. It really takes them in, but then really forces not just your characters, but you as the person consuming the story to reflect on the cycles of violence, which I know is also another trope that we see very often. But I think a big thing that this does is it shows the way in which the character, yes, has the questions arise of, am I becoming the very thing that set me on this path in the first place? And am I becoming someone else's origin for their life to be consumed with hate? But while that is something that you essentially expect from revenge stories, I think Vinland Saga does something, not to sound cheesy, but it does something very special with it, where it really forces you to see the darkness that can consume a character. It really forces you to see how much you're not even really living anymore and what you can become when this is your sole focus. And the saddest part is that you had somebody already able to step away from this, and you could almost argue know the true meaning of life, and they so badly tried to instill that in the characters. So then to see this clashing between what that influence wanted for our main character versus what they end up doing and becoming is so tragic to watch unfold, but you just also are kind of hoping that maybe someday they can come back to it. But that is the general idea. It is a revenge quest. It is a historical fiction story. It does weave in a lot of real individuals from history as well as ones that are almost more lore oriented, but it definitely places you really firmly into the setting. I think it captures this exceptionally both in the manga and in the anime by having the actual settings look like the places that if you've ever been to those places or seen pictures of those places, they actually do look like those areas. The culture is very well executed in my opinion. The way of life, the way they view the afterlife, their concerns, for example, the cold is actually a serious issue that they have to deal with. Violence, war, for the anime specifically, the music also I think is very fitting to the setting. It absolutely captures the vastness of the land itself, of the might of the sea, the clothing, the day-to-day life, all of that really makes you feel like it is very lived in. And even though it's historical fiction rather than something like fantasy, which I know a lot of us are big fans of, I do think setting up the area in which the characters live plays a role in their mindsets, which absolutely is integral to understanding the character of Thorfinn and the path that he sets out on. Despite it being historical fiction and being placed within something many years before our time, something that I think also sets the story apart is that it's very easy to extrapolate a lot of the themes and apply it to our own lives. So much of the story is really asking the question of, do you actually truly have enemies, and what does it mean to have an enemy? What does it mean to be a warrior? It's more upfront about them in this setting because you have people in the traditional roles of warriors, the way we tend to think of them, but also there is this question that you have to ask yourself and that the character has to ask themselves about what it means to truly fight. The reason I think that this is so significant and is something that is applicable throughout not only the past but the present as well is that there are always going to be people that can use individuals to push them in directions that don't actually serve them or the greater good, you could say, to once again be rather cheesy. But there's always going to be somebody who is trying to instill hatred in you for their own gain, for their own purpose, and it's not actually what you should be wanting out of life. It is very heartbreaking to see where the story starts and the progression of the character. It definitely doesn't shy away from really digging deep with those themes, really showcasing how violent the world can be, how brutal the world can be. But really, truly, if you give this a go, I think the first 6 episodes actually establish a lot of these things really, really well, give you hints of what's to come when it comes to the depth of the story. But I would absolutely encourage that if you do give it a try, push past these first 6 episodes. If you pick up the manga, it does start in a different place than the anime, but they do eventually get to the same area. And I would encourage the same thing. You just gotta kind of trust that the story knows what it's doing. It's not just this action-packed, cool Viking tale, which it is, but it's not just those things. All that said, jumping into the spoiler section, we kick this story off from actually, instead of Thorfinn's perspective, you're actually looking at his father's. That's where the manga and the anime differ. But I am primarily going to be sticking to the anime as opposed to the manga. So we'll go ahead and say that the story kicks off with Thor's in the middle of a battle. And he initially is imagining his wife waving to him with their child. And then he is sort of oriented back to the present, which is being in this battle in the middle of the sea on these ships. And I think that the show captures really well the lack of interest or passion or care for him in this moment. He doesn't really have anything really motivating him to fight in this glorious way that we so often see in these action scenes, despite the fact that he is obviously incredibly powerful and incredibly skilled. He just goes about everything with such a lack of emotion. And then there is sort of this, like, what's the point of it all that you see right from the start. This is why this story breaks my heart, because I feel like he figured it out right there. Basically, almost, you could say, the meaning of life. Thorfinn's father is looking at the situation and being like, I don't care about any of this, and I don't want to kill these people. I don't want to die either. I don't want to do this. And so we see him fake his death. He leaves. And then we go to Thorfinn as a young boy. He's being told this exciting tale by Leif Erikson. I have to interject for just a moment. I went to Iceland and there is a statue of this person, and I just think it's so cool. I mean, I find all of this so fascinating. I love when historical fiction stories have these characters within them. It just makes it feel that much more like, oh my gosh, I'm being told this tale. So then to have us with the kids, like, you kind of feel like the children themselves being told this tale because you're like, oh, I've heard of this person before. So it was really fun to have that be something that you see within Thorfinn's childhood. All the children are so consumed by the tales that Leif is laying out for them. But something that I think that we do really well and establish really well right from the beginning with the little boy being Thorfinn in this moment is that instantly when the kids are starting to question, like, I kind of think you're just an adventurer. I don't think you're a warrior. And then Leif's like, you kids need to learn some manners. And he's like, you think I'm a warrior, right, Thorfinn? And he says basically that he would believe him if his father says so. A lot of times children just see their parents in this, hopefully they have loving parents who care for them. And if they do, they see them as these sort of heroic figures. And even without knowing his father's past, he still just looks up to him so much, admires him so much. So there is this kind of like, I'll defer to him, whatever he says must be the truth. You do see that Leif is trying to acknowledge that there are different paths in life. You've already seen Thor's kind of establish this. You see Leif is saying this as well when he tells the children that there's different ways to be a warrior. To be out at sea is to battle against the sea. And he's kind of trying to see them where they are and then present these other paths in life, these more peaceful paths, as things that are still worth living. But this is such a hard thing because they've been told their whole lives by a lot of the tales that they typically get and the heroes that they've been presented, and also their culture and religion. They believe that to go to Valhalla, they must die a warrior's death. You even see Thorfinn when he's playing with his friends and he immediately gets wiped out, that he's just laying there. And then he questions, like, will my mother and sister get to go if they don't die in battle? And it's just so sad to see this little child contemplating, but also it's good because they're questioning and wondering these tough questions at an early age. But regardless, to be a warrior is to live peacefully in the afterlife. And this is why the opening, I think, is so exceptionally well done. And I think it really pulls in the themes almost without you even being aware of it. That juxtaposition of starting with this action and seeing how useless and pointless it all is, and then going to something very simple and rural. You see him milking the cows, you see them feeding the sheep. To go to this, it almost seems like you're going from something typically in a story, depending on how it's laid out for you. It's like, here's the excitement and the action, and then here's like boring everyday life. But in actuality, it's like, this is the simple things that we should live for. Our family, caring for animals, day-to-day life, just trying to be there for each other. And the clashing of these two things right from the start, what's interesting is that there's almost this idea that if you do well in this area, this action that we see at the beginning, then you can have this paradise. But there is this sort of, when you're listening to Thorfinn, there's this realization of you already have this. You have this idea that you must go die in battle in order to have peace and prosperity in the afterlife. And there's a lack of awareness and realizing you already have that here. Yes, it's hard. It's demanding. There are issues. It's not like everything is absolutely perfect. But this idea that you have to do this is part of why I feel that it's such a hard thing to take out of their minds, and Thors is trying so hard initially to instill in his child this acknowledgement that you have no enemies. I'm getting a little ahead of myself because we have that statement said a little bit later, but this idea that like this is what life is. This is what actually matters. Obviously, we do see that there is a lack of peace for many people as Ylva finds a slave that has run away from Halfdan. Thors ends up paying for the slave, and it costs so much for them, but he's willing to do it. Up to this point, I've definitely been focusing more so on how Thorfinn has been a product of his society, but also you see very much Ylva's reaction showcasing this as well. She doesn't understand why her father is willing to pay so much for this slave. She especially doesn't understand when the slave just ends up dying. Just before even finding the slave, she's asking her father, "Oh, work is hard. Can we get a slave?" So there is definitely a way of life that is uncomfortable, and it doesn't feel great to acknowledge that these characters, that they are a part of a society that has slaves, that they think about owning slaves, that you would even have somebody who is so young wanting one because it would make their life easier. Because it's a historical fiction setting, they're not trying to show characters who are obviously good and that they are going to just know what it is to be a good person and what it is to be heroic and to go against the norm, because a lot of times you are going to be basing your view on life and your principles on what you've been fed. So for her, I don't know that when I hear these lines, I think like, oh, well, I guess they're all bad. I don't even want to engage with the story anymore, because I think to have that would be disingenuous. In order to see how people push forward and how society progresses, you kind of have to acknowledge the uglier sides of it. And this is one of the ugly sides of it. A character who did have everything figured out, it feels like in a lot of ways, is Thors. And he didn't always, because we do see that the story doesn't really fail to acknowledge that he was the same way when he was young, when his wife gave birth to Ylva. This isn't within this first episode, this is a little bit later, but you see the way he doesn't really seem to have any care for the child, both emotionally and even how he's holding it. And it is kind of funny when the women are like, "Oh, please support her head," and they're all concerned, but he might as well have just tossed the baby back at Helga, because he's like, "Give me a boy next time, that's what the leader wants." And she insists that he name the child, acknowledge its presence. And you do see him say eventually that that is when he started not to care about what was happening on the battlefield, because that's just all he wanted to come back to. So he has reached a certain level of enlightenment, if you want to call it that. But it doesn't mean that he started in that place, so I do appreciate the inclusion of where where he began. He too was a product of his society. In this moment, though, given that he understands what it means so much to seek peace, to avoid violence, you do see him willing to give up so much so that this man can have a peaceful death. It is such a tragic moment when you don't really know anything about this individual other than that they clearly didn't live a very comfortable or happy life. But there's this statement of acknowledging that their family members were sold when he was young, and he thinks, "I didn't think we'd ever be reunited." it's been so long, I didn't think you'd be here too. Just that alone is so sad to watch, and Thorfinn sort of just observes. It seems like everything, his whole worldview is having these warring things, and I think this is furthered within this first episode also with the fact that when Leif is explaining how people came to be in Iceland, and he explains that their ancestors wanted to get away from tyrannical rule. And he even shouts it, there's no way that my ancestors would have run. And then later you see him ask his father, because once again you see that he always turns to his father to look for the acknowledgement of what is right, what is wrong. And we do sort of leave off in a place where he is asking, did we run away too? And there's this parallel between his life and the slaves. Obviously, the slave's life, he didn't really have any sense of freedom, and for Thorfinn, so much of his mindset is based in freedom, in having a life worth living, and just not knowing what that means. But also, he doesn't really seem to completely grasp the extent of brutality that exists within the world and why people would want to escape that. I do like that the title of the first episode is Somewhere Far Away, because that can mean so many different things. It can mean that Iceland is so far from Thor's, what he experienced before and where he was before. You can think of it as this place that Leif has been to. You can think of it as the place that the slave is going to when he passes away. There's just so many ways to interpret it, and I think that that's the point, that there is somewhere far away, but also people are always looking for that next thing, that sense of peace, the area where the land is going to be sprawling and you can finally be free. So I do really appreciate that the name is already kind of tying in a lot of our themes and tying a lot of our characters together. The second episode is titled Sword. I once again like that we start with an action scene, but rather than go from action into simple everyday life, you go from action to play fighting. And what I appreciate is that there's an extreme level of violence in the actual fighting, and then you see the play fighting and there's this sense of happiness and glory, and this is so fun, and the kids are just playing because they have no idea and no realization of what actual war looks like. You also see the character of Floki introduced. He obviously does not seem pleased to find that Thors is indeed alive, that he faked his death, that he walked away from this path, and he now is threatening that if the call to battle is not answered, then the villagers are going to pay the price. And when everybody hears, oh, we have this opportunity to go to war, we have these opportunities to gain glory, everybody is so full with jubilation, whereas Thors looks so sad. And I really like the way the frame is laid out, where you just see him hanging his head and everybody surrounding him is celebrating, because of all of them, he's the only one that actually really knows what it looks like. At this point, there's a lot going on internally with little Thorfinn. He doesn't really know how to process a lot of what's happening. He doesn't understand why his father seems to be going so against a lot of what he's been told is glorious, and thus he starts acting out with a lot of the other children. And a part that I feel like is somewhat understated, but I think is really fantastically done and just shows how hard it is to break out of this environment, is that later Thors goes to patch up one of the kids that he doesn't realize at first it was his own son who hurt them. And there's all the kids there, and there's an adult, and the kids are basically telling on Thorfinn, and they're saying, he's the one that did this, he doesn't play by the rules anymore, it's not fair, that kid's wild, basically. And Thors is shocked to find out, my son did this? And all the kids are like, yeah. And he's looking around and he's seeing all these little kids that are sniffling and angry and hurt. And then the adult is the one that seems to think that this is no big deal, and that it's great that Thorfinn is so strong for his age and that he has so much fight in him. And the fact that he's laughing it off and not realizing the pain that has been caused to all these little kids. And Thors is the one that's looking around, realizing what his son could become, is so devastating, because you're like, oh, I need all the adults to be like, I need everybody in the world to be more like Thors. This next part I feel like is very difficult for me to even address without getting emotional, so we're just going to power through it. But you do see Thorfinn is thinking, I want to go to war, I don't understand why I would be left behind, surely if I just had the right equipment, which is when he finds his father's belongings, and he is looking at it just filled almost with awe. And you see the father come in and grab the dagger. And he says swords are tools for killing. And then Thorfinn very passionately is saying, but we have to kill the enemies. And his father says, what enemies do you have? And Thorfinn just thinks of someone, and he just says, like, Halfdan, because in his mind, that's the biggest threat, which that person does seem terrible, but also that's not really his enemy. And that's when his father tells him, you have no enemy. Ugh, this is what I mean by it's so hard for me to get through this line. And if you know Vinland Saga, you know why. But when he tells him, you have no enemies, no one has enemies. Ugh, it breaks my heart every time. It's so well done. And it's such a simple statement. It's not like it's profound in its wording. It's not artistic. It is very straightforward. But that's what I really like about this statement, is also how it complements that, what I just referred to as that juxtaposition in the first episode, from starting with action to going to simplicity. And that simplicity, like, all the answers are there. It's not actually that complicated. You don't have enemies. We don't need to fight. We don't need to live a life of violence. You don't need more. So it just breaks my heart. And also just the protectiveness of this father for his son, and how much he wants to ensure that his son understands this. Obviously, we know by the end of these 6 episodes that it's not clear to him and that he is lost. And he's lost because he thinks that he has enemies now because he wants to avenge his father. It just breaks my heart. But then at the very end of this episode, you are introduced to Askeladd. I know there are a lot of different pronunciations for this character depending on whether you watch the English or the Japanese. There are going to be different ways of pronouncing this, excuse me. Kind of ironic that I didn't say the word pronounce right. But anyway, there are a lot of different ways. I'm going to say Askeladd, as this is what I believe is, from what I've looked into, the closest to how the language would actually have it be pronounced. But just know that I acknowledge that they might say it slightly different in the show, and that depending on which language a person is basing this off of, they might say it slightly different. But I want to get back to the point. Askeladd is introduced at the end of this episode. We do also return to Askeladd as well as Floki and Bjorn at the beginning of the 3rd episode, which is titled Troll. And you see when Askeladd's trying to determine what he can from Floki about what kind of a fighter is this troll, what is he like, and Floki just says that he is no longer a warrior. Once again, establishing what the norm is for how they view people like him. We see him as a hero in a lot of ways. Floki obviously does not. And I think there is this sense of anger and almost hatred because Thors goes against everything that Floki respects. Obviously, there's this sense of dread and knowing that there are people that want to hurt Thors, but you do segue from that into something a little bit more lighthearted, which is the fact that all these young men who are thinking they're going off to earn glory in battle all want to basically propose to Ylva, and she's just tired and just wants to go back inside, which I do enjoy that part. Within this episode is also the moment that I was talking about before. Once you see that they are out at sea and they're having this quieter moment, you see Thors is being very affectionate and loving to his son. He obviously is looking at him very lovingly, and he is telling Ari about when he realized that he no longer cared about fighting. There is a very funny moment before this where you see that all these young men have their own oar, and then Thors has this one massive oar. I do like the little bits of humor in the show. You kind of need it because the rest of it is just so brutal and tragic. Sense of dread, though, that you get from Askeladd's introduction, it does not take long for this to end up facing our characters. So you see them within the Faroe Islands going through this area. They are surrounded by Askeladd's archers, and then they are also confronted by his crew. Immediately during the ambush, when they push things over so that the boat cannot keep going, you see that Thors goes straight to protecting his son. We also see another instance of them portraying Thors's emotions extremely well with his expression. I already complimented how disinterested he looked, how pained he looked in previous scenes, and then here I think you get one of the most devastating moments from him when he's looking at his weapons and he just has this sense of sadness because he doesn't want his son to go down a path that's even remotely similar to the one that he lived, but he doesn't know how to have his son be completely defenseless. And so you see him grapple with this in this very, very quick amount of time, and then he hands him the dagger and just tells him only as a last resort. Oh, that pain in his face and in his voice is exceptionally well done. You then get to episode 4, which is titled A True Warrior. Why do these titles have to be so emotional as well? Because obviously within this whole section, you see him fighting. He is clearly so much better than everyone, including Askeladd, and it is through deception and a lack of principles that these other characters end up defeating him. But he was not only the best when it comes to strength, but then he had such this like kind of mighty sense of wisdom and peace within him that you're like, oh, why is this happening? Even though you know it's coming, it's just so sad to see this. And also, poor Thorfinn cannot understand. He really cannot grasp why, when his father was the best, why would he cast aside his sword? Why would he give up? It just doesn't make sense to him. I think there is this sense of guilt as well, feeling like it is his fault, that he was somehow responsible. If only his father hadn't cared, and if he had just kept fighting, and if he had struck these men down, and he can't make sense of it. And I think that that's an exceptionally painful thing within this all, is that it isn't fair. It doesn't make sense. He should have won. He should have come away from that where all of you could have left and been safe and everybody would have been fine and he would have been the victor, and then it could be just a story that you tell. But all of the things that have been leading up to this point with Thorfinn kind of questioning what anything even means, it all sort of comes down to this point of like, what does it mean? Because my father lived by a set of principles and it meant nothing in the end. Nobody honors this, and he's now alone, and the only people that are there to even somewhat be now parental figures to him are the very people that took everything from him. There are a couple of lines within this very sad scene and sad episode overall, though, that I want to acknowledge. Thor's, for example, when he is kind of contemplating what he's going to do, he looks over to his son and thinks, if only I were alone. He also says a true warrior needs no sword, as well as to rely on this means I still have much to learn. I think this ties really well with what we saw in the previous episode when he is questioning the decision to hand the dagger over to Thorfinn, because he acknowledges, I haven't found a way to not have to use this. And I think he would have especially wanted to have found a way to ensure his son never had to use this. Also, you then see Askeladd tell Thors, this victory is yours, right before he is shot down. And I think there is this sense of, you found the way to ensure that you didn't have to kill anybody in this moment. Your son gets to live. These young men that you obviously care about get to live. So it's not just acknowledging that the physical fight was won, but also the things that he stands by. He still got to stand by those. It just meant he had to sacrifice himself. And then there is a line that I feel like, based off of all of everything that happens, is easy to kind of forget about. But Ari actually does try to kind of step in and do something on Thor's behalf, and Askeladd is so much more powerful and skilled than Ari, so he very quickly kind of just deals with him. But he also seems relatively angry at him and tells him, idiot, cherish your life. Do you have any idea what this man just did for you? And I do feel like this is the introduction to the complexities of this character. Then this leads us to episodes 5 and 6. I do want to note something about the names of these episodes. So episode 6 is titled The Journey Begins. I hate that that's the name of episode 6, because you're like, no, I don't want to think of it like this. But then with episode 5, depending on where you look for the name of this episode, sometimes it says the troll's child and sometimes it says the troll's son. I personally think that the title, the troll's child, is better suited for it, as you don't just start to see Thorfinn going down this path that is going to lead him to violence, which is what you saw from Thor's, and also just this general idea of there being a certain level of skill that you would expect from the troll's son, that sort of thing. But also how Ylva is handling the news, because you do see that Leif goes back to Iceland and says, I promise I will find Thorfinn, I'll bring him home. And at first, Ylva is just like, well, yeah, I expected this. Father was always eccentric, figures he'd get himself killed, and then just goes right back to her everyday life. See her when they're dealing with the whale, when they're feeding the sheep, she's trying to do the weaving, and the mother finally takes something from her. And then it's only when her hands are empty and she can't force herself to basically work through, literally as in having something physically in front of you. She doesn't have anything to work through, and thus she's only left with her thoughts, and it's at that moment that she finally breaks down. Ugh, it is heartbreaking, but I also feel like her ability to just kind of keep going also is an indication of, you could say, her father's legacy, that she has something very resilient in her as well. We're so focused on Thorfinn that I think it's easy to forget about how this is affecting her. Returning to Askeladd, though, sadly, one of the first things that happens within episode 5 is that they pillage a village in this area, and obviously Thorfinn is witnessing this. He's thirsty. Everybody's like, oh, the kid is probably going to die, whatever. They don't really pay him much mind, but he sees the brutality of Askeladd and his men. And you also see some of the brutality, even though I think certainly the show leans into a certain level of, breaking bones and people dying in horrific ways and almost cartoonish ways. While there is that present, I do feel that I don't feel like they lean too much into sensationalizing certain kinds of brutality just for entertainment's sake, which I do appreciate. I mean, you get the picture, you understand, you're left very unsettled, but I do respect the way that they execute these certain sorts of things. After this occurs, you do see Thorfinn wrestling with the idea of killing Askeladd in the night. You do see Askeladd was awake the whole time, and you do wonder why he didn't do anything, because Thorfinn doesn't know that he's awake. Askeladd, you don't know, is awake until after Thorfinn leaves. It sort of makes you wonder, would he have stopped Thorfinn if he had continued or actually pushed through? Was he just curious to see what he was going to do? There's a lot that you could pull from that moment, but regardless, Thorfinn can't do it. He still is holding on to this idea of, I have to be principled and honorable in some way. I can't kill a man in the night because that's what a coward would do. So then you see him start to obsess over the idea of, well, if I challenge him to a duel, that's how I'm going to get revenge. You also see him really embracing that sort of very close-up personal way of fighting by using the dagger as opposed to the sword. It first starts with the wolf, and then you do get a montage getting up close and personal, which I think is, you could almost say it's just the weapon that he has, but I almost feel like there's symbolism in it because he could have tried to get better with the sword, but rather there is this sort of, to kill a person is so personal, and I think that's symbolic of the fact that so much of this journey he's going on is like a personal journey, which is probably reading too much into it. But point is, there's a montage, and this is what I just want to say. The music is so good. I complimented it before. It is fantastic. There's sometimes phenomenal music over scenes where hardly anything is happening, and I'm like, why is the music so good in this show? I feel that the music in this, I don't know, maybe I'm just not in enough circles that talk about the music in anime, but I don't feel like the music in this is acknowledged for how beautiful and lush it is. It's incredible, and it's so moving. I really think that they utilized the music exceptionally within this story because, I mean, this is one of the tools you have within an adaptation, is you have not just great voice acting and not just great sound effects, but the music. We all know music can pull out our emotions a lot. It's not that it relies on it to do it and that the storytelling is weak. It's that it complements the storytelling. Anyway, the montage happens, and I just wrote montage with great music in all caps. So good. Anyway, getting back, though, to the actual events of the show. This episode ends with Askeladd telling Thorfinn, earn your place in battle, and then we can duel again. And not only has the obsession with this concept started, but now you've given Thorfinn a target. You've given him something to try and achieve. And this is really where the path starts, and becoming lost also begins. Which segues us into episode 6 really well. The journey begins. This, I remember in the manga, because I did look into the manga before starting this, because I believe I started this story before the anime even existed. This was one of the most heartbreaking moments for me, of this woman who just is trying to do the right thing. She is aware that there's something very strange about the situation of having a young boy who's in the condition he's in, and if he is a spy, well, that doesn't seem right. And she takes him in, and obviously it ends with Askeladd and his men coming into the beach, and he tried to tell them, Thorfinn tried to tell them to run, and then you just see her looking so sad, crying, as everybody's fleeing, and also seeming almost in shock. And you just see him looking at her, she's looking at him, and then she just fades away, and then you see the comb broken. This is, I think, a great example of what I was talking about before, where they don't shy away from showing violence, they don't shy away from there being the brutality of war displayed for you. But it's moments like these where I almost feel like by leaning into either something very brief or something almost more artistic, it sits with you longer. It's almost like these pivotal moments that end up standing out because they're not done in the same way as everything else. When Thorfinn is starting to really, even though he did want her to run, so there's something in him that knows, I don't want this. He even sees his own mother and sister when he's looking at her, and then he sees his father looking how he was before. And then you see the broken comb. And I do think that there's a lot of ways also to interpret this scene. Part of it for me is almost like the fact that he is really suppressing everything. He's pushing everything down. He's kind of shutting off the part of him that is more human. And I think a lot of times revenge stories take much longer to get to this place of a character deciding that they're going to set all of that aside for the revenge that they're trying to gain. Usually it takes much longer for there to be this moment where you kind of want to shake them and tell them, like, don't you see you're becoming the very thing that you, again, everything I said at the beginning of the discussion, but it's showing it right here, this early on. You're looking like, oh, why are you doing this? You didn't have to do this. You could have, I mean, I get that he tried to tell her to run, but also once he sees it, you think, turn your back on this, drop your knives, walk away, do what your father did in the opening. But instead, he sort of acknowledges this happened. He acknowledges his place in it to some degree. And then he just continues on with Askeladd's men. It's the worst. It's so sad. I hate this moment. It's very haunting. I think that's the best way to put it. How they portrayed her just disappearing is like this, almost like this ghost that's going to linger with him now. I did jump around a little bit. Apologies. The montage that we got before was sort of like a training montage with Thorfinn, and then you get the he's getting older and killing a lot of people montage in this episode. But the first time he kills somebody, it's interesting because you actually see Askeladd save him, which is, again, why you're like, does this guy care? Does he not care? Because earlier it kind of seemed like he'd be fine with the idea of Thorfinn just dying from thirst and starvation. Now that he is still alive, he's like, and he saves him. And you're like, what? And he saves him and kind of is like, give me a challenge. Keep living so that you can try to kill me someday. And you're like, that's an interesting way to raise him, question mark. You know, it's like this relationship is, Luna can't handle it either. This relationship is very bizarre. The point though is that during this ambush scene, Askeladd does save Thorfinn, and then Thorfinn goes on to have his first kill, and he cries. I think this is the beginning of him having a very raw reaction to what's happening, but then he just carries on. So he's establishing this pattern that you then see getting to a much sadder point when this woman who nursed him back to health ends up passing away. And this is what we're left with by the end of episode 6. It's a really, really awful place to end. I do think constantly watch this just so sad because you saw the little boy that he was. You saw how much his father loved him, and you saw the sense of happiness and peace that they had before. And to see the path that he's gone down, you really just so badly want it to end. And it seems like the end is nowhere in sight. Such a terrible place to leave off. But I do think that this opening is incredible. I do think it leans into being exceptionally brutal in certain moments. And I do feel like there is this sense of heightened and exaggerated prowess from, for example, when Thors defeats all of Askeladd's men. He didn't kill a single one of them. He hardly even had to do a whole lot to defeat them. Part of why I don't mind this being utilized in the story is because I feel it's very fitting for a historical fiction setting where there is so much emphasis on these tales and these great figures in battle. So I think it fits, even though it might maybe for some lean into being a little cheesy. I do like the inclusion of it. I think it just really captures the setting and the kinds of tales that we have within this time period. But regardless, I feel like I'm just sort of, I don't want to stay on the sad moment. I'll say one thing that was very silly for those of you who are video game fans. When there's the one part where Thorfinn, initially he only had one dagger, and when he's being ganged up on by these two men and he ends up taking the dagger out from the one guy and then killing him with it, my husband was like, dual wielding unlocked. So that's what I'll leave you with. We have unlocked dual wielding, we've leveled up, and it's very sad. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day. If you have more thoughts, feel free to leave them, and I'll see you later. Bye.
Luna, this is a very serious moment. Be serious. Be serious.